without further ado, welcome to today's webinar, Sacred Civics, Building 7th-Generation Cities, featuring co-editors and co-authors, Jayne Engle and Tanya Chung-Tiam-Fook. My name is Laura Schnurr. For those who don't know me, I'm the director of Tamarack's Community Climate Transitions Initiative. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting today on Indigenous land. I myself am calling in from Tiohtià:ke, the traditional unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk people, colonially known as Montreal. And many of us are joining today from cities and places that were built primarily by settlers and colonizers on land that Indigenous peoples had stewarded and cared for since time immemorial. This is a key theme of the book that we'll be discussing today as we consider how to decolonize urban spaces and make the commitment of reconciliation and Indigenous sovereignty real across the spaces and places we find ourselves. I will, in the meantime, introduce our speakers, our guest speakers today. So we have Dr. Jayne Engle, who is an urbanist, strategist, experimentalist, and curator of ecosystems and change processes, who wears multiple hats. She's an adjunct professor at McGill School of Urban Planning, co-director of Participatory Canada, Participatory City Global, and until recently was the director of communities at the McConnell Foundation, which is where I know her from, and also a co-editor and co-author of Sacred Civics, the book we're discussing today. Dr. Tanya Chung-Tiam-Fook works on climate and ecological resilience, Indigenous knowledge and partnerships, innovation, placekeeping, and health and mental wellness in her role as co-director of Participatory Canada, Participatory City Global with Jayne, director of research and programs for the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology, part-time faculty in environmental and urban change at York University, and consultant for Future Cities Canada and other organizations. She is also co-editor and co-author of Sacred Civics. Those are just short bios, but you can see our event page for full speaker bios, and Jamie has put that link in the chat. So welcome, Jayne and Tanya. It's an immense pleasure to be able to host this conversation with you both today. Jayne and I had the pleasure of working together for several years at McConnell Foundation, and Tanya and I met a couple months ago at the Montreal book launch of Sacred Civics. If you haven't had a chance yet to read Sacred Civics, the book we're discussing today, highly recommend it, of course. It challenges us to reimagine how our cities and communities function, including our relationships to one another, our relationships to the land, to nature, and to all species. And I find it's a particularly great summer read, actually, because I don't know about you all, but I'm finding the summer I'm especially open to transformative thinking and ideas. Was just spent some time in nature, camping, and totally unplugged from work. And I was just finishing up the book, and just spending time in nature and with family and friends, for me anyway, is a great opportunity to kind of regain perspective in terms of what's important. And I felt like I was especially receptive to the ideas of the book, and felt like, yes, we can do this in a way that, not all times of the year I'm necessarily that optimistic and hopeful. I mean, I try to retain that throughout, but just felt like really receptive. So totally recommend this if you're heading camping or going out into nature. So Jamie also put the links in the chat to where you can order a hard copy of the book or read it for free online, the open access version. So let me stop the screen share so you can see our speakers, and perhaps turn it over to you, Jayne, to begin by asking you to kind of unpack this term Sacred Civics, the title of the book. This is a term I had never heard before, and I imagine many people on the webinar today won't be familiar with this. So how would you define this idea?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the question, Laura, and thank you so much for the kind introduction and those kind words about the book. Others have told us that it was actually quite dense reading, so maybe not best for summer. But I'm so delighted to hear that for you had a different take on it. So that's wonderful, and I'm glad you've passed that on. Thank you. So first of all, thanks to everyone also who is here for your interest in Sacred Civics and Seven Generation Cities. And I want to offer also greetings from the place where I am, which is on the same island as Laura, Jojage, which is also known as Montreal. And I want to acknowledge and also express a gratitude that Indigenous peoples have been here for thousands of years. And they have been loving and caring for these lands and waters and taking responsibility to steward them. And I want to express gratitude as well for nature herself, without whom there is no life, including in cities, something that we can sometimes forget, which brings us to the notion of sacred civics. So what do we mean by that? So simply put, Sacred Civics, as the title of the first chapter says, it invites that we imagine shaping cities as if people, land, and nature were sacred. And sacred as in intrinsically worthy of dignity and respect, being alive and of a mystical life force even, having agency in relationships of reciprocity and care. And a Sacred Civics lens on infrastructure and institution building invites what we call higher order accountabilities. So by that, we mean accountabilities to health of the earth, of Mother Earth, and to future generations, and to all people outside of political boundaries. So that means we're talking about a planetary solidarity and acting and building upon that. So it also invites upending basic societal assumptions about how things work, because there's a whole lot that we consider almost as natural law or even sacred natural law that is actually socially constructed. So land ownership, extreme concentration of wealth, roles of corporations and of capital, sovereignties, jurisdictions, legal systems. So all of these are social constructions, and therefore they're possible to change. Are they easy to change? No, of course not. But are they necessary to change? I'd argue that many of them, yes. And we must, it's really our responsibility, I feel, those of us alive now, to make choices and find pathways to changing some of these things that are driving us further into the cascading crises that we're experiencing now. So Sacred Civics, it also helps us to upend the myth of separation. So one of the myths of separation that is ever present in cities, and it's one of the things that that gets me up in the morning and also that keeps me up at night, is that cities are very often thought of as separate from nature. And it doesn't have to be that way. Again, that's a social construction. So Sacred Civics is about opening up worlds of possibility to see things in ways that we can't then unsee them. So one thing that I love to imagine is cities as if there hadn't been genocide, if there hadn't been colonization, if there hadn't been massive enslavement of peoples and of lands for that matter. And a metaphor that I think is so important to think of. I also love futurisms and science fiction, and I love the film Black Panther and can't wait for the next one to come. And of course, Wakanda there is about imagining a society in Africa that escaped those horrors. And so Wakanda really becomes a metaphor that helps us to imagine and question, for example, what are the social, physical, and digital infrastructures to build now so that children in 7 generations will thrive in equitable and regenerative cities. And so finally, just I would add that Sacred Civics, it really invites us to truly make truth and reconciliation manifest in cities. So it invites us to build the collective wisdom for that in our city building, including in our institutions, our infrastructures, and our investment decisions. So the idea of 7 generation cities invites us to ask, is there another way to think about city building that's fit for future generations? I say emphatically yes. And we, the 25 authors, actually Tanya and I are just two of 25 authors in the varied chapters of the book. And we, in this work, aim to provide contributions in responding to that question. So I'll pause there. Thanks.
Beautiful, thank you. Tanya, how about you? Anything to add to that pretty extensive definition of sacred civics, or what's your understanding of the term?
Thank you very much. I echo Jayne in my deep gratitude to the Tamarack Institute team, to Laura in particular for inviting us, and to all those in the audience, again, who are really interested in our book and kind of taking that deep dive into what is sacred civics. Yeah, I think, Jayne has done a beautiful job of outlining what we have been thinking about and trying to activate through this kind of new paradigm, this sacred civics paradigm. But I might just add a few little pieces, if I may. So for me, sacred civics brings kind of a deep consciousness and real world approaches and pathways to what it means to see cities as a home for all beings and lands beyond the material and commercial manifestations of the many structures, commodities, flows of capital that cities, come to be associated with, flows of technology as well. So what also does it mean to center sacred connection, grounding in relationships, as Jayne mentioned, with all life and all beings? What does it mean to think about reconciliation between people and the earth and among sovereign peoples? As engaged residents of cities, city builders and practitioners, we've envisioned sacred civics as enabling us to recognize our sacred roles and responsibilities as world builders and system changers through conscious and embodied cultivation and care, of our relationships and with one another and the earth systems that, I think are nourishing and providing for us and our cities. And this includes righting colonial, extractive, and imbalanced relationships. It also includes thinking about how we integrate that earth consciousness, the reciprocity, equity, wilding, agency, justice, vitality, and resilience in our designs, in our planning, in our decisions, in our investments for better futures for all peoples and beings, particularly within, different forms of public and community engagement, community building, neighborhood economies and wealth building, placekeeping and placemaking, urban planning, city building in all its many forms and manifestations. And for diverse Indigenous and land-based peoples, bringing in the sacred or spiritual work into community and city building is kind of like creating that connective tissue or mycorrhizal network for how we think about, live, and practice in cities through a common sacred connection, through that interconnectedness that links us to land and place, to our ancestors of the past, but to our future generations that are still to come, and also influences how we build and sustain social and governance institutions that are good for all people's lands and natures. And a designation and respect also for sacred and ceremonial spaces within cities is also very, vital for me in terms of thinking about sacred civics, including those that recognize Indigenous or cultural ancestry of place and land of many different cultures and communities and lineages, and spaces that and social infrastructures that invite spiritual and ceremonial practices of our faith keepers, our knowledge keepers, our elders and healers, whatever name or however they hold those roles in our different cultural and social communities. And, so these are central elements of placekeeping and city building, especially thinking about, sacred civics. And at a practical level, I think for all of us, bringing in the sacred dimension represents the potential that people, cities, and societies have, in terms of our capability to transform and to transcend a lot of the current paradigms and status quo, business as usual logics and thinking and systems that have proven to be so extremely problematic and unjust and untenable for most people and for most communities and even a lot of institutions and organizations. So as Jayne, again, mentioned, Sacred Civics would really have us reimagine, how those patterns of how we house, feed, govern ourselves, build and distribute wealth, inhabit and design cities, steward our relationships with one another and with nature, how we can not only reimagine those patterns and try to create new ones, but how can we work collectively over the long term, in very sustainable long-term relationships, forms of collective and decolonial action, co-building, so that we can bring about or manifest, what we think will be, or what is possible and what will bring about that really positive, nourishing, transformational change and a sense of flourishing for all people. So I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So you both described a really beautiful future, a future that I hope is possible, but would require so many transformations, right? It's looking so different from what we are experiencing today, where many of us live today, although there are elements of this sacred civics showing up in different places. But you speak about in the book how a shift to sacred civics kind of mindset approach requires at least 3 transformations. And there you unpack a bit the evolving societal systems to value the common good, developing stronger cultures of commoning and collective action, and cultivating and practicing wisdom that open pathways to creating healthy cities for the long term. And also some of the assumptions that we need to bust in order to make space for these transformations to occur. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about those transformations, and maybe starting with you, Tanya.
Thank you, Laura. I was thinking quite a bit about, a lot of the concepts, themes, and propositions that we discuss in Sacred Civics, including these transformations, and they're of course not new. They're actually seated in quite ancient and ongoing philosophies and practices from around the world. But what we've really tried to do in Sacred Civics is, I think, is re-enliven and explore their value, wisdom, and application in today's world and contexts of both kind of these wicked and cascade that too, but also hope for positive, equitable, and transformational futures across societies and ecologies. And so in thinking about a common good worldview or valuing the common good, I think it, of course, places human equality and flourishing through access to healthy food, through good education and healthcare, safe housing, fair wages, political and cultural agency, regenerative natures and economies and relationships as the pinnacle for how societies and cities should be built, organized, and governed. And, as we kind of have imagined it through Sacred Civics or that paradigm, we're thinking about how a common good worldview can aim to unlock individual and collective agency of all people and all beings, and that kind of bounty of human capabilities and freedoms. And so in this way, we believe that, you know, what we need has always been with us, really, but potentially, again, given new life and adapted to the particular times and contexts that we're now in 2022. You know, so for how I tend to think of it is, you know, from the air we breathe to the food we eat, the way that our bodies, knowledges, societies, and structures have co-evolved in attunement with our different environments, with our fellow species, that sense of interdependency and affiliation with the natural world, the cosmos. It links us in those moral and ethical ways to all other beings and compels us to live by those higher level accountabilities that Jayne mentioned, you know, to other people, to even a design life cycle in terms of what we produce and its impacts, to the earth and to future generations. And if we think about, or if we recognize the agency and rights of all peoples to basic needs, freedoms, realizing their full capabilities in a flourishing life, then the hyper-individualism and extractive practices, market logics of our current global capitalist economy, society become illogical and unsustainable. If we recognize the agency, inherent rights, and self-sovereignties of natural systems, then the concepts of private ownership, of control, and damage even of these life systems and beings becomes illogical and untenable. You know, so I tend to think about how can we work together as treaty holders, as ancestral guardians, settlers, you know, residents, creators, practitioners in all forms, even decision makers and politicians, to manifest the common good through a common purpose and set of values, a set of praxis and accountabilities that can be adapted and activated within our civic engagement and infrastructures, our innovation pathways, our policy and governance across spheres and sectors, sectors also like institutions, investment areas and infrastructures. And then thinking about wisdom, you know, wisdom means a lot of different things, and we could be here for 5 years unpacking, you know, what wisdom means to each of us. But for me, wisdom stems from reflection, adaptive and iterative learning, both from our personal, but also especially our collective experiences and explorations. And it also stems from guidance from the natural world, from the lands, the waters, the more than human kin that we share, you know, our environments and our cities with, but also from our knowledge keepers across cultures, but also fields of practice or disciplines. And so when we bring adaptive learning and wisdom of our ancestors into the present, then we can manifest the future. So wisdom and design kind of enable us, I think, to breathe new life into and innovate ways of knowing and doing that, as I've mentioned before, have often already been with us, sometimes for generations, even for centuries or millennia. And, you know, so they're really responsive to our contemporary challenges and contexts and how those ebb and flow and evolve over time. And so, you know, we're, I think, rarely kind of starting from scratch. We're always building on those learnings, knowledges, innovations, and I think what a lot of Indigenous peoples call wise practices of the many who've been working to develop our worlds in different ways, kind of standing, you know, if you will, on the shoulders of the many who've come before us and our contemporaries as well, who are doing this work collectively together. And so, you know, thinking about commoning with wisdom, and I know Jayne will speak quite a bit to this as well, but, you know, I tend to think of, you know, how commoning and the commons, even though we may not have used this language over you know, the centuries, millennia that this practice has been engaged, this form of being and doing in the world has been around, but you know, it is definitely an ancient practice of provisioning for the common good, you know, of all residents, of the more than human. It's an ancient practice of collective land holding and stewardship. And in our contemporary worlds, you know, the way that, again, we can re-enliven and revitalize and adapt it into our contemporary context, you know, it can become that pathway of reciprocity for collectively established roles and responsibilities for guardianship and governance of commonly shared lands, resources, food systems, housing, digital spaces, knowledge and information. It has the potential to be highly effective and sustainable as a form of, I think, profound systemic transformation, and strengthened by those holistic social relationships that people, you know, that our ancestors, but, you know, again, bringing it into our present day context, you know, we do hold social relationships to our local land and food systems, to our civic assets. And, you know, so how can those be, you know, reactivated and strengthened and, you know, really put at the forefront of our policy decision-making investments, you know, the kind of focus that we hold together. And as, you know, I think a form of civic organization and governance of natural built digital spaces, it's important that commons be activated also through the social relationships of decoloniality, social and ecological justice, participatory community action and governance. And just a few quick little examples. So local neighborhood-based economies and approaches to community wealth building commons can provide racialized and marginalized communities with the capabilities to build and regenerate new kinds of wealth, including, again, you know, the different types of capitals, not just financial or economic capital, but natural, social, knowledge capital. But also, you know, our different forms of well-being, you know, health, social, economic, spiritual, physical, that can support, you know, all of our ability to thrive. And commons thinking and practices mirror the principles embodied by Indigenous treaties and covenants, and even the land back movements across Turtle Island and globally. They also mirror a lot of the of African and Afro-diasporic models for mutual aid and cooperatives, you know, different cultural examples of collective property regimes, farming cooperatives, community land stewardship, and then, of course, knowledge and digital commons. Jayne and I have even had an opportunity to connect with a wonderful community of brilliant young folks who are developing a digital pluriverse, you know, as a new iteration of you know, digital and knowledge commons within the digital space. A commoning approach that has a lot of possibility for cities as well that we bring forward in the book is also connected to valuing the common good and the provisioning of the common good for all, and that's cosmolocalism and peer-to-peer, you know, networks where peers or people people freely collaborate with one another through those common-based projects and common good institutions, where high and low forms of technological capacity are provided for localized production across a range of different material goods. So, from food to tools to clothing, household and industrial products. And in so doing, they reduce the ecological and carbon footprint of production and then work to support our planetary commons. Again, a really vital example of how we can think about valuing the common good within our contemporary moment.
Thanks for those reflections. Yeah, a lot of what you were saying made me think about the inner transformation that's required for this societal transformation and kind of the human dimension of this work. There's great shifts in mindset that we need, shifts in values, that's so essential. Jayne, over to you with this question. Any thoughts on how we make this tremendous shift towards a sacred civics?
Sure, thanks. And I won't say too much because Tanya covered a lot of ground. Thank you for that, Tanya. But maybe I'll just say that this is a moment that really invites transcendence, right? And Laura spoke about individual transcendence, and it's also a collective transcendence. And we speak about that in the book as well. And what we're finding, which is very promising, is that there is a much greater reception and resonance to this book even than we expected. And sometimes, it's sort of like the rock bottom of addiction in a little bit. I don't necessarily love to use that metaphor, but sometimes when things are clearly heading in crises that some of us expected, but also is surprising to many, some of what's cascading now, we realize that we actually have to take jumps in some of our societal collective intelligences and collective wisdom building. And that invites transcendence. It invites seeing differently. So notions that Tanya was talking about of thinking differently about commoning is just one example that is super important, and we see, we see people like Saskia Sassen and Sheila Foster asking the question, who owns the city? And if the answer to the question of who owns the city should be that we all do, then that actually means that we have to have commoning much more as a default rather than default being tending to be private ownership and increasing concentrations of wealth and power. And the good news is that there are so many examples in practice and in policy that point the way towards how we can do this. And we also find that at the city scale, there are particularly promising examples. So some of the things that give me a whole lot of hope in this regard have to do with some of the city networks that I see. So, there are things not only like many of you will know C40 cities, which of course C40 cities partly grew out of the decision by Donald Trump to pull out of the Paris Agreement when he was elected, and a number of U.S. cities said, wait a second, we actually don't want to pull out of the Paris Agreement. We actually think that climate is pretty damn important. And so they organized, and now C40 cities, and not to mention community climate transitions, the work that Laura and Tamarack lead, all kinds of work is showing the way forward. Other examples are, in the US, there's mayors for guaranteed income. There is now a network of mayors organized for reparations and equity, which is incredibly promising. Co-cities, which is about cities who are increasing their commoning practices and so on. So I really see tremendous promise, even though we have to do so much more. There are many things in place that point to ways where we can transcend some of these incredibly extractive paradigms that we're stuck within. So there is hope.
Thank you, Jayne. Tanya, you authored a chapter on Indigenous teachings for city building and how we can decolonize our cities. Curious to hear what are some of the ways that cities can embrace Indigenous models and practices, and perhaps an example or two of cities or communities that are embracing teachings and Indigenous ways of knowing and being.
Great, thank you. That's one of my favorite questions. And I'll try to be as succinct as I can. Again, I could speak for days on all of these different questions. So yeah, I think as we look to developing this kind of sacred civics way of thinking and of being and doing, this paradigm of urbanism and approaches to planning, placekeeping, urban land stewardship and governance. Again, we've been thinking about how we need to individually, but also especially collectively, work to decolonize many of the dominant approaches and pathways that have been particularly, they've been damaging for all of us and our lands and more than human kin for sure. But, we recognize, of course, that there are particular communities and social groups within our cities that are particularly or disproportionately impacted by those more dominant and even the kind of colonial mindset and logics that have unfortunately continued in many different ways through our different institutions and decisions and systems. So these have been quite damaging for Indigenous peoples, for other racialized and marginalized peoples in our cities. And so, how can we then instead prioritize diverse pluriversal values and approaches, including those of the first peoples that have always inhabited the lands that cities occur upon. And so, Indigenous sovereignty has been continually, I think, constrained by the accumulating impacts and impositions against Indigenous lands and waters, again, that occur in rural areas, that we tend to think about rural areas or rural reserves, homelands, but also very much so in the lands and waters that cities occur upon. And these have come about due to climate change, environmental degradation, our extractive development, economic development pathways. And so, with those constraints to Indigenous sovereignty, how can we then center truth and reconciliation and the bridging between what often seem to be disparate communities and worldviews in ways that are transformational and systems changing? And so for me, that's really vital to the future of cities and our ability to build 7-generation cities. And at the heart of truth and reconciliation is that transformation of both human earth or human nature relationships, as well as settler Indigenous relationships. And so, that includes a number of different commitments, I think, that we have to collectively make together. One is honoring and restoring sovereignty and inherent rights, land rights, cultural approaches, and participation and leadership in the co-building of new structures and systems for Indigenous and racialized peoples and other socially and economically marginalized communities. It also means honoring the self-sovereignty and inherent rights of urban and rural natural landscapes and species, recovering their health and well-being, And it means also reconstituting Indigenous settler relationships through more respectful and reciprocal relationships, building a regenerative economy based on how we can more equitably share and co-steward the abundant wealth and gifts of Mother Earth across Indigenous and settler societies. And I think we can shift power and responsibility from institutions that traditionally dominate spheres of decision-making, policy, and practice, and reimagine more primary leadership roles and responsibilities for the network of residents, practitioners, creators, youth, knowledge keepers, scholars, etc., that are, working really hard to courageously and boldly reinvent our cities, often from the bottom up. As well as working on the investments, the policy lenses, the infrastructures that can effectively and sustainably work to manifest those visions and initiatives from now into the future. And, and I think a place that we always have to start in cities and thinking about, especially, if we want to draw particularly on Indigenous teachings and wisdoms in our city building, thinking and practice is, Indigenous treaties and covenants, and that those are built upon and honored through the elements of natural laws, sacred values, ceremony, culture, and land-based teachings, governance, and conscientious relationships. They provide those vital sacred agreements outlining our respective and sacred roles and responsibilities as both Indigenous and settler peoples, for not only kind of peaceful coexistence among our peoples, our communities, but also, again, coming back to those reciprocal relationships of use and stewardship of our natural environments, that are, really relevant in our contemporary forms of governance of our cities, and how we enact city building in the times that we're in. And so, I was thinking also about how for the future of cities and how we share space and co-create new pathways, we must not only acknowledge treaties with Indigenous nations in symbolic ways, such as land acknowledgements, or as an element of colonial history, that has already passed, but really understand and commit to the deeper, ongoing, and relational sacred agreements of what it means to live on treaty lands, and or other configurations of Indigenous settler agreements and Indigenous homelands. And so, in thinking about 7 generation cities in particular for the book, is also thinking about how, across our different Indigenous cultures, and again, the language and how it might be symbolically or metaphorically, expressed or manifest through our different teachings and stories. But there is this idea of 7 generations or multiple generations that have shaped us in our past, from our ancestors, as well as today, and then going forward into the future. And so, we have an immensely important opportunity to shape the forthcoming 7 generations in ways that align with our sacred covenants and relationships with the earth, with the more than human world, and among nations and diverse communities or societies. And so our elders call upon us, to provoke the future through the emergence of a new sacred paradigm that could well be patterned on building 7 generation cities and the Sacred Civics 7 foundational keys that we bring forward in the book for unlocking our collective imaginaries and what is possible. And we say new, but again, as I've mentioned before, new meaning for the times we live in now. But again, this paradigm, and especially the teachings, values, and visioning that constellate it, are ancient and deeply grounded and activated in different ways through many cultures and societies over time. And so whether through origin stories and allegorical prophecies, such as those that I bring forward in the book, so the Anishinaabe Seven Fires prophecy from Turtle Island, the Amazonian eagle and condor prophecy from Abiyala, our original instructions, stories, the emergence or re-emergence of a sacred paradigm give us an orientation for how we can be and live in reciprocity, and archetypal, this kind of archetypal awakening of sacred energy and consciousness through both the deep shifting that's going on philosophically, physically, environmentally, energetically, structurally, in our planet, in our global society, and also this path to transformative reconciliation for Indigenous and settler peoples. And such a paradigm like this, I think, recognizes the resurgence of Indigenous wisdom and knowledge around the world and reinvigorates our collective work to build relationship, connectivity, and world bridging. And when we share and activate our respective and collective teachings, as we walk our path, as we do our work together as community practitioners, city builders, we're rekindling, but kindling the eighth fire and moving toward wise understanding and practice, moving towards sacred relationship and respect for all life, and the renewal of the earth for the next 7 generations. And so, I think in terms of a couple of examples, so from Canada, from Turtle Island, what we call Canada, but Turtle Island, we've seen, that municipalities of all sizes have an opportunity right now to particularly manifest the principles and calls to action around truth and reconciliation, as well as the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within placekeeping and city building policy and practice, to become what in Vancouver they've called the cities of reconciliation. So the city of Vancouver, through the very courageous work of one of our authors, Ginger Gosnell-Myers, and a team, they have developed or created a framework, a city of reconciliation framework, that was designed to honor Vancouver's Indigenous history and culture, and compels all departments of the city to find new ways to conduct city building, design and planning, land stewardship in acknowledgement of the unceded First Nations that Vancouver occurs upon, their ancestral and unceded lands. So the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsalil, Watuth nations. And Vancouver has also become the first major city in Canada to commit to implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as formally acknowledged by the First Nations Leadership Council. So it's there's a lot more work to do, and these are just the initial kind of actions toward a very vital transformative shift that's going on. In one of our chapters has also been authored by Yvonne Takao and Michelle Thompson Fawcett, and is situated in Tonga, in the Pacifica region, and describes the transformation of urban planning in Tonga from persistent colonial and culturally inappropriate Western land use and urban planning interventions, and administrative managerial structures that led up to the 2006 democracy riots. So a transformation from that you know, that pathway of planning, and you know, that was quite damaging to the culture and the community, but also to the lands and the urban environment, so they've moved toward a more holistic approach of urban development planning, inspired by the Chung-Tiam-Fook, which is a traditional house, and it comprises cultural, social, economic, and environmental pillars that should be equally prioritized and mutually reinforcing, so that they strengthen together the integrity of the planning structure of the country. And of course, you know, again, both in our context here in Turtle Island, but also in Tonga and all around the world, the legacies and impacts of colonial urbanism and the prioritization of economic development over other pillars or values and principles, you know, mean that there's still a lot of work to do to activate those more kind of cultural, spiritual, social pillars. So in the Tongan context, the planning fale, you know, is an amazing, you know, foundation for this much needed work, and will hopefully continue. And so, yeah, so those are a couple of examples.
Thanks. Thank you, Tanya. A really rich response, and appreciated those examples. I need to look more into the Vancouver one in particular. I'm going to dive into that, and makes me think very related to the idea that Alexandra has shared in the chat. What if a next step after the publication of this great book would be to create a Sacred Civics city network or coalition? The power of peer learning is something that we see and feel here at Tamarack when we bring communities together to learn from one another and what they're doing. We see an acceleration of local impact and a sort of a take-up of what different communities are doing in the local context. So love that idea. Maybe it's something you've been thinking about. We have a few more minutes, and I do want to ask you another question, Jayne, about social infrastructure. But feel free, if you have questions, to keep them coming in either in the chat or Q&A box. But Jayne, I'm going to turn to you. You write about social infrastructure as the often neglected form of infrastructure that is at least as essential as other forms that typically get more attention. So could you describe the term a bit more? I like how you describe it in the book about as soft infrastructure that we rely on to hold society together when the hard infrastructure collapses, as they often do in times of crises such as pandemics, climate disasters, terrorist attacks, and so on. So how would you describe this notion of social infrastructure, and how can we ensure it's participatory in its nature?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just take a few quick minutes on this. So social infrastructure really is much more than just the soft extra stuff that that we do with that we do with leftover money when we have it. It actually is about who we are as societies. It defines what matters to us, how we're collectively enacting the present and imagining the future. I really like what Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg said in the US when they were having their infrastructure debates near the end of COVID, where he said physically robust infrastructure is not enough if it fails to foster a healthy community. Ultimately, all infrastructure is social. So if we know that cities are people, then how we actually navigate our coexistence really comes down to the social infrastructures that we have. So it's everything from spaces, facilities, systems, and platforms that that actually mediate or provide the enabling environment for civic interaction that helps groups to meet their needs, to maximize potential and so on in ways that can improve shared and collective well-being and resilience. And what I'd just like to add, though, is that we talk a lot about social infrastructure, about community centers, about daycare. Sometimes affordable housing is referred to as social infrastructure. But if social infrastructure is not participatory and systemic, then it really risks being something that is seen as short-term and also something that is easily cut from budgets. And so I think how we think about social infrastructure has to be much different. And I'm conscious of time, so I won't go into detail. One social infrastructure that we're involved in building, and one of the chapters goes into the case of the participatory city approach. So I invite you to take a look at that chapter, but also there's a website of Participatory City and also of Participatory Canada. But really, that is about inviting the creativity and agency of people to grow their skills, resources, friendships, and so on, and to do it in a way that is a systemic infrastructure for long-term change. And in Canada, we're building it in a way that centers truth and reconciliation. And we're very excited about that. It's called Everyone Every Day Chipuktuk Halifax, where the current deep demonstration learning campus is being built. And it's one example of how we can advance a social infrastructure that is about transcending existing paradigms as we've been talking about through the book. So it provides an example, a real manifestation in real life of what this can look like. And I should pause there in the interest of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayne. Yeah, the work you're doing with Participatory Canada is so exciting. I've been following it for a few years and would really encourage people to
I'm sorry, can I just jump in? I have to respond to Alexandre. I love his question and his suggestion. Merci beaucoup, Alexandre. Donc, tu es une bonne personne aussi de réaliser ça. So it's a great question about a network of cities, and Alexandre happens to be an elected city councillor, so he could help lead the way in this. So thank you for that, and I'd love for that to be one of the follow-ups to the book and to this call. So thank you.
Fantastic. Great. Yeah, I think it's such a neat idea. So wonderful. Okay, yes, let's just looking at the time. We're just at the end of our time together today. This has been such a wonderful session, and I've learned a lot from you both, even after having read the book. So thank you. Just wanted to share a couple upcoming webinars, or an upcoming webinar. Jamie has shared the link in the chat. What is the role of citizens in community change? This looks like a really fun one, hosted by my colleague Lisa in early September. And that is with John Alexander, the author of the new book, Citizens. And also wanted to mention Communities Ending Poverty has an online member gathering coming up in October. So it's a virtual event bringing together members from that network. If you have any questions or would like to register, you can contact my colleague, Natasha at tamarackcommunity.ca. So that's it. Here's my email address. I'm at laura@tamarackcommunity.ca. I welcome any thoughts, reflections, feedback. If you have any ideas to follow up with, you can let me know. And again, we will be sharing the recording from this session and additional resources in the next day or two. So keep your eyes out for that. Thank you for being here today and for all of your comments and questions in the chat. It was a true pleasure. Thank you, Jayne and Tanya, once again.